everybody. It is 8 o'clock, so I'd like to welcome you guys to this session. I am your chair, Solena Mednicoff. The session is in musical structure, and I also happen to be your first presenter. Again, I'm Solena Mednicoff from UC Irvine, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about my research in the effects of tone duration in discriminating major and minor modes. So without any further ado, a little bit of background before we get into it. Although we assume that people listen and experience music in similar ways, there's actually growing evidence for people experience music in different ways. And so I'm going to focus specifically on the major and minor musical mode discrimination under this context. And so some of these studies have focused on presenting musical stimuli that are either played simultaneously as in a chord or successively as in a melody. But for this talk, I'm going to focus on two papers that have used musical stimuli called tone scrambles. So, what is a tone scramble? A tone scramble is a type of musical stimulus that isolates any effects on mode that results from musical structure, such as rhythm or timbre. It induces a clear tonal context for the listener, and it comprises of 32 tones in total, totaling 2.08 seconds long, and therefore each individual tone is 65 milliseconds in duration. So the major tone scramble comprises of the G major chord, and so it has scale degree 3 as to signify that it is major, and it sounds like this. So it's very quick. Whereas the only difference between the major tone scramble and the minor tone scramble is just the scale degree 3. So instead of B, it now contains a B flat, and it sounds like this. So in these experiments with tone scrambles, listeners are presented with either the major or the minor tone scramble, and then asked which one they heard. Corrective feedback was given after every trial, and the listener does not necessarily need to know that is major minor. They just need to know that is either type 1, type 2, or happy and sad. We give them each of these effective labels just to try to get them to know that these are two separate sequences. So the results from these experiments showed a bimodal distribution in performance, where 70% of these listeners performed near chance, where the other 30% were near perfect. In this figure, it's only reflective of 80 participants, but in the 2013 paper, there's about almost 300 participants that were ran in this, and so, which is shown here with all of these listeners. And so you may be inclined to ask, does musical training matter in these experiments? Well, the researchers found that training is not necessary nor sufficient, as highlighted by so musical training may not be necessary because there are many individuals with no years of musical training that performed near perfect on this task, whereas there are many individuals with many years of musical training that actually perform near chance on this task, so it may not be sufficient. So these findings show that high performers may possess some sort of processing capability that these low performers may lack. So Dean and Chum in 2017 investigated this idea further by using 5 more tone scramble tasks that tested sensitivity of individuals to a range of different semitone scale differences, and found that performance in all of these tasks was highly correlated. So therefore, they named this processing capability R, or scale sensitivity. That leads us to the current study, where I question, is this named scale sensitivity actually warranted? Because the difficulty in this task may solely be due to how rapid and random these sequence of 32 tones really is. And so my driving hypothesis for this experiment is that if the stimuli are presented more slowly, then the gap in sensitivity that separates the high and the low performers should disappear. And so the low performers should effectively perform better if the stimuli are a little bit slower. So how do we go about answering this question? So in addition to the original 32 tone scramble task, which is labeled here as the 8 task, we added 3 more conditions, or slower conditions. So first, we use the same major notes as in the original 32 tone scramble task, as well as the same minor notes. Like I said, we had 4 different tasks within this experiment, and so each of these tasks are labeled by how many copies of each of the major notes are within the stimulus and how many copies of the minor notes are within each stimulus. And so, for example, the one each major only has 1 copy of each major note, whereas the one each minor has 1 copy of each of the minor notes, and so forth. And so our main variable that we manipulated was the tone duration of each of the individual's tones in the stimuli. And so the slowest task had each individual tone being 520 milliseconds, while the fastest task, again, had 65 millisecond tones. And so just due to time constraints, I just want to play you the slowest stimulus versus the fastest stimulus. And if you're curious to want to know, to listen to the other stimuli, I put a link on Moodle, which you can access later. So here's the slowest stimulus. Versus the fastest. So again, participants went through each of these tasks and had to, on each trial, were presented with either the major and the minor tone scramble and had to respond which one they heard. And again, corrective feedback was given after every task. As for the results, we had 73 participants run in this study, and although we predicted that the slowest task would be the easiest task out of all of these conditions, we actually found that performance in the one task was significantly worse than all of the other tasks. And so there are three main points that I want you to take away from these scatter plots. So we analyzed our data under a signal detection theory framework where D prime is essentially the sensitivity of each listener. And so these scatter plots show D prime performance of all listeners in one task and compares it to D prime performance in all the other tasks. So like I said, I have three main points I want you to take away. One, there exists a large group of listeners that actually perform at near zero in each of these tasks. Two, there also exists a small group of listeners that perform near perfect in each of these tasks. And also there exists a group of listeners of intermediate listeners whose distribution and performance highlights the relative difficulty of each task being compared. So I want you to show you the one task as compared to the other three tasks. So if you look at these intermediate listeners within, say, the one task compared to the 8 task, if the two tasks were relatively equal in difficulty, then these intermediate listeners would fall more along this dotted line here. However, these intermediate listeners perform a little bit better and towards the 8 task than, say, the 1 task, as you can see here as well. But if you look at, say, comparing the 2, 4, and the 8 tasks, these intermediate group of listeners do follow along the dotted line a little bit more closely, and therefore these tasks are a little bit more equal in difficulty. So our data can be described using the same bilinear model as in Dean and Chubb in 2017, where across all listeners K and all tasks T, performance was well described in terms of a single cognitive resource. So R sub K in this equation is equal to the amount of R possessed by all listeners K, and F sub T is equal to the strength with which R facilitates performance in task T. And so under this model, performance or D prime sensitivity for each listener K in a given task T is equal to the product of the level of R sub K times F sub T. So if we estimate this F sub T under this model, you can see that the one task was a little less facilitated than the other three, much less facilitated than the other 3 tasks. And then if we estimate our levels of R for each of our listeners, which is shown here in the left figure, we can multiply that by each of these values from the previous graph, the F sub T, to get the same predicted proportion correct for each of these different tasks. And so the figure on the right is this proportion correct for the 8 tasks. So therefore, a model does predict the same bimodal distribution as seen in the previous 2 papers. So how well does this model describe our actual listeners' data? It explains 84% of the variance, actually. So again, the bilinear model results are on the x-axis, while the unconstrained listeners' data is on the y. Then you still may be inclined to ask, well, what about musical training with this cognitive resource R? So this figure shows levels of R for each listener as a function of their years of musical training. Although musical training may not be sufficient enough to possess the highest levels of R, as evidenced by, say, like this guy with 18 years of musical training performed with very low levels of R, it still may be necessary to achieve the highest levels of R because you can see there are no individuals with no non-musicians that achieve the highest levels of art, say like these guys over here. So to conclude, some few main takeaway points. The tone scramble task does not get any easier if the stimuli are presented more slowly. In fact, the one task actually proved to be the most difficult out of the 4 conditions, and that the bilinear model describes the data fairly well, and that it gives strong evidence for a cognitive resource R that mediates performance on all 4 tasks. I also conclude that most listeners, musicians and non-musicians, possess very low levels of R, and that a bimodal distribution in performance is still seen across listeners, as replicated in the other 2 papers. And then we can also conclude that musical training is not sufficient to attain the highest levels of R, but it still may be necessary. And so my lab is myself and my lab are continuing to question this, and maybe would a brief training regimen help raise the R levels of low performers? And so to conclude, to answer my question, scale sensitivity is indeed warranted for this cognitive resource R. So I would like to thank my lab, Chubb Wright Lab, and my PI, Charlie Chubb, as well as a fellow grad student who helped me mentor these wonderful undergrads who helped me with this run this experiment. And so I'd also like to thank SEMPRE for travel funding, and most importantly, Center for Hearing Research at the University of California, Irvine, for all of their support. So, any questions?
I'm gonna ask the same thing as you, I think.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So we just kind of looked at each other because in my experience teaching oral skills to music majors, you often have the problem of, okay, here's a major chord and you play it in root position, so you GBD, right?
Yep.
Once you inverted and you have the minor interval, the minor third interval in the bottom, so BDG, they lose it. They don't hear as a major triad anymore because of that prevalence of the minor triad in the bottom. Or you might have other types of problems. So I'm wondering if, I mean, there's some inhibition caused by this minor tonality.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've thought about that. Also,
we actually have thought about that. And
okay.
so we're going to one study we're gearing up to do right now is we're trying to compare just performance in the tone scramble task with kind of this musical structure where it does account for that inversion. And so we're going to try to keep those types of inversions out of there. And so we're going to specifically have it. Actually, I have a group of undergraduates who are music majors that are interested in this, and they're really the masterminds behind this experiment that's being designed. And so they are the ones that actually brought that up.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, so great question, thank you.
So the other thing that I was wondering about is that, Psyche Louis has some interesting work saying that about, between 10 and 20% of the population has a blindness for the difference between a whole and half step, right? And so I wonder whether that also could, and some of them are musicians, right?
Right.
And so I'm wondering whether that might also just account for the difference.
I have not looked as far into her work as that, but it's a possibility. But I've been meaning to, actually. That's one of my things on my list, is to look into Psyche Louis' work. So it's definitely possible, and there's actually, I'm noticing a lot more work where it's kind of like a lot of people who you would assume would be very good at some of these rhythm or musical tasks and are musicians, and they're like, wait, what's going on? So maybe it's something with experiment, or because experimental versus actual being in the music of things. I'm not sure. So maybe that's something in future directions we can figure out. Oh, or do we have live with anyone else? Okay.
Yes, I was wondering about the metacognition. I was wondering if you would ever ask for confidence ratings after these judgments.
That's a great question.
Because one might, I'd be curious to see whether people actually think they're doing better when, say, in the 4 and the 8, and also whether musicians might think they're doing better.
Yeah. Well,
And vice versa for some of the people at the bottom. And it seems like a free set of data you could get just by asking a confidence
Yeah.
rating.
so we do give corrective feedback after each trial to try to allow people to figure out whether they're doing good or not. And so if they've listened to a minor, it was a minor trial one and they got it incorrect, and then they get a major. Okay, now we know that's the other one. So that kind of metacognition of trying to figure out a strategy or whatnot.
Yes, that would be a different sort of
Yeah.
thing. And if you went with the confidence rating, probably I wouldn't give feedback because you want that metacognitive judgment to be sort of pure. At least maybe in the first half you could do confidence and then maybe give feedback or something like that. But it seemed like a for free kind of thing that you could add to a layer of
Just
interest
another,
here.
yeah, exactly. No, that's
Yes.
a really great suggestion. Thank you. I think I'd like to do that with my next experiment that's comparing the musical structure with it.
Hi, thank you so much. I might have missed this during your talk, but while you were asking, is there something built in there to see if they were consistently thinking type 2 was type 1 and type 2 was type 1? Were they consistently
kind of
inaccurate?
Opposite.
Yeah.
And so I've considered that where maybe they're thinking one is one, completely the other, but the data doesn't seem to agree with that, at least from what I've seen.
Okay, thank you.
No, thank you.
Oh,
It doesn't matter.
okay. Hi. Great discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I just wanted to ask, I don't know if you mentioned, but you mentioned musicians and non-musicians were subjects. Were they, in terms of the age bracket, or were they all students? Were they?
They were all students, and so they were all mostly undergraduate students from UC Irvine, and so I would say age range between 18, 25, I want to say, around roughly. And
Okay.
so, but our main variable of interest was how many years of musical training did each of them have, and so that was collected by self-report.
And were they all just typically around the same in musical training, or some more?
Some were more, as you can see here. Some had up to 18 years of musical training, and say that performer had very low levels of R, whereas there were still many non-musicians who also participated in this. But it was a fairly large range of years of musical training.
Thank you.
I guess sort of piggybacking off of that, I wonder if you would consider a different measure of musical training. I'm not sure if you mentioned what questions you asked to get at years of musical training, other than just, have you practiced an instrument for how long, that kind of thing.
So,
But, sorry.
Oh, yes, we have considered that. And so we've asked first how many years of formal musical training and whether or not it's self-taught or formal music lessons, as well as have they participated maybe in a choir previously, because, elementary, or maybe in a church choir or something like that too. And so we've considered that, and it doesn't seem like there's at least a correlation in the choir.
Yeah, definitely.
But please keep going with your question.
Yeah, I just wonder, and maybe we can chat later, but there are some really interesting studies about musical training, and sort of meta studies of what makes a musician a musician, and indexes that are generally more less categorical and more on a line. It might be interesting to see how that has to do, because someone with 18 years of choral experience may be very different from 18 years of
That's a very good point.
something like that. And if there's an undergraduate in a music class and oral skills, and we're actually learning these sort of memory tasks and things like that, they all contribute to musical sophistication in a way that might be interesting to see with your results.
One variable I did collect that I actually have not looked at more closely at is how many years of musical training, and when was the last time you played, or if you're a music major, and so whether you're currently practicing musician and how many hours a day do you practice. Those are still two variables I've yet to look at. Yeah, I'd love to chat later. Thank you.
All right.
Do we have any more questions? Time
We're
for
running
questions?
out of time for the next presenter. All right. Thank you.
Thank you. Alrighty, we'd like to introduce our next speaker in this session, Connor Davis from Louisiana State University.
Thank you. So today my talk is going to be a little bit different than a lot of the strains of talks here. It's very philosophically oriented. It's outlining my future direction basically. So I'm going to be talking about expectation theories and specifically towards a noumenal tonality. So some of the goals, to demonstrate how expectation theories can be a tool to analytically define tonality and thus music. So expectation theories and specifically the empirical methodologies also need to be, in my opinion, integrated with some of the historical aesthetic considerations with contemporary empirical methodologies. So just starting to outline sort of my point. So most people in here should be familiar with or are familiar with expectation theories dating back to John Dewey is when they started to get empirical. And so John Dewey links his emotional responses with aesthetics, particularly in a Darwinian framework, which concerns itself with how nature has affected the development of certain expectations. This is a key distinction between traditional aesthetics, which is concerned with judgments of taste, but is not concerned with emotions per se, nor are traditional theories of aesthetics necessarily concerned with utilitarian arguments of Dewey. And then Meyer, and a couple people in between Meyer and Dewey, but Meyer took these up and applied them specifically to music, and he defines this as the inhibition of a tendency to respond, or, on the conscious level, the frustration of expectations is found to be the basis of the affective and the intellectual aesthetic response to music. So this is just figure 1 from Meyer's book. It's an exemplar of the psychological underpinnings of these expectation theories at work in music. So presented with a partial phrase in the key of C major that moves through the chords 1, 2, 6, and cadential 6, 4. And my question is, what does this progression generate in the mind of Western listeners? And the answer is transparently the expectation of resolution to some degree or another. And moreover, it's more than simply an expectation of certain tones to resolve, but an expectation that they resolve on beat 1. But what are the physical properties of music that generate the expectation of resolution? And the Gestalt principles become helpful in this case. So according to Meyer and many others, and probably most people in this room, the organization of stimuli is not arbitrary. It is actually directed by various Gestalt principles which group seemingly unrelated objects in our surroundings. So this triangle is representative of the law of closure, and the law states that objects grouped together are seen as a whole. And we can see a floating triangle that doesn't actually exist. However, if we deform the things that actually exist, the Pac-Man, if you will, then we can study the relationships of the things that actually exist via our cognitive organization of them. We can study the immanently present triangle in both cases. And this is a key component to my argument for a noumenal tonality. If we can study these Pac-Man of music, then we can get at the noumenal tonality and ground our epistemology in a metaphysics to make better ontological claims. We can study our cognitive perception of the world and make claims about the noumenal, thus bridging the hypothetical veil of Maya of the noumenal and phenomenal realms. So just to outline, I'll define some terms here and how I'm using them, already used a few terms that are very specific in the way that I'm using them, and then talk about response theories for a little bit, and expectation theories and how they relate to my greater question in tonality and aesthetics, and synthesis and example, caveats and conclusions. So in philosophy, they're generally considered three main branches. We have metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics. I'm concerned with the first two, metaphysics and epistemology, in the direction that it goes. So metaphysics, you're claiming to know something, and then the epistemology is how you know that. Won't deal with ethics today, but that would be something to talk about in the future. So broadly, what is aesthetics? It's the study of beauty, and various theories of aesthetics relate to each other by where the beauty is found. So for example, response theory situates an object's aesthetic value in a subject's response to that object. And that's contrasting to formalism, which considers something aesthetically valuable because of its fitness to a definition of beauty. And in this case, the aesthetic value is found in the object and not in the subject. Aesthetics, again, is a study of how we know beauty, so it fits under the branch of epistemology. And I'll primarily be engaging with response theory, as they're often implicitly present, if not explicitly present, in the methodologies of many empirical aesthetics research. So again, noumenal and phenomenal, and both of these terms relate to metaphysics, but more specifically, they belong to a sub-branch of ontology, or the nature of things, a thing's existence. So noumenal is a thing in and of itself, and it is typically considered unknowable, but this is an obvious paradox, because once you state something about something, you're saying something about it. And moreover, even this claim of such a category puts it in the knowable. As a result, I will use this as the realm of all stimuli, of which some elements we perceive, but many we do not. And then the phenomenal realm is the world of appearances. So the phenomenal realm is essentially the world of perception and all the apparent cause and effect relationships that we perceive. Typically, in a strictly empirical epistemology, the noumenal realm is bracketed for a strictly phenomenal epistemology. And I should note that these usages are a more contemporary use, as the historical one embraces the paradox of the unknowable realm. And the key is that the dotted line is a hypothetical veil of Maya in which we cannot cross, but stimuli cross into the realm of appearances. So moving on with why I consider response theory problematic. So I'm considering response theory because it's the most readily operationalizable from a psychological and cognitive perspective. It's the most inclusive in that it accepts anything as potentially aesthetically valuable to a subject. And it focuses on the influences of the perception. That's statistical learning, cultural predispositions, contextual influences, like where a piece is being listened to. But the key is that the focus is not on the object, but rather on the subject. And I believe that this is ultimately the most problematic. And at the root of this is it's circular. It's circular because the claim is that the aesthetic value is defined by the existence of aesthetic value. And this reduces normativity to a claim of taste and prediction. And this form of normativity isn't actually a real normativity. It's actually relativistic, which is a naturalized epistemology, which is to say, at its base, it brackets metaphysics, resulting in this circular argument. And if this epistemology is tasked to explain the possibility of empirical knowledge, or even any ontological claims, it then cannot rely solely on empirical knowledge to justify itself. So a purely naturalized epistemology asks us to ignore a priori normativity for an exclusively deductive epistemology of perception and cognition. So in short, normativity is central to epistemic matters per se. So to eliminate normativity of the object is to lack certain epistemic groundings in reality as such. So I believe the solution is to identify some sort of normativity. And normativity in this case is the a priori assumption of the intention of an object. And in philosophy, we would call it the purposiveness or the teleology. It's my, it's okay, I think it's my lanyard. One way to consider this purposiveness is to think about the use of an object. So if you have a pen, the pen begs you to use it as a pen, and there's an appropriateness to using it as such. Whereas if I were to try to smoke a pen, that's not the right way to use a pen. And you can tell me that I'm actually using it wrong. So note that this is defined as an object and how it demands to be used. And there's an appropriateness to this. And it's a universal claim of use, independent of an individual's actual use. Like you can say you're doing it wrong, and there's an expectation that we hold others to such a correct use. In music, I would identify the central normative feature as tonality as a noun, taken from higher. And tonality as a noun is meant to describe the organizing principle that exists before the music is written or perceived, and the features of sound waves that lend themselves to be organized in certain ways. This is in opposition to tonality as an adjective, which would be specific cultural organizations. And finally, I would say that we need to define tonality by its necessary but not sufficient conditions. So expectations fit this mold to get at my greater question because they are normative. So fulfillment of expectations is a normative claim, even if it's a closed system. You can claim that someone is doing it more or less correctly, depending on how they decide to resolve this phrase from Meyer. And so listening to a time span or something with a head is a necessary constraint to listening as a human. So this time span listening, arguably even innate structural listening, takes stimuli and assigns them meaning. But so far, all of our models are culturally derived, and they don't account for the traits of the sound waves per se, and they don't attach their meaning to deeper roots of practical music making. So again, what are the Pac-Men in this music? So in essence, how can we trust our aesthetic perceptions as pertaining to reality as such if our models are limited to relativistic contexts? So synthesizing, I would argue that music is made from more than lifeless stimuli that do not perpetuate themselves, and that the existence of musical universals as described by Savage can be interpreted as a teleological or purposiveness of the musical stimuli. And one example that I would give is the semitone as a Pac-Man. So Bell and Yerdajik describe variation in a semitone in cochlear research as 1.06 plus or minus 0.005. And this promotes a certain amount of discrete pitch organization, even a 12-tone division of the octave. And this even has a gravitational pull as described by Shera, where on the cochlear, if you map these, the discrete pitches pull to the next pitch either way, depending on how close you actually get to the next pitch. So for future directions, I will establish a clear way to illustrate tonality as a noun in real music making. So whether it be mathematical, music notational, or statistical, and that's a big reason why I'd like to have a discussion about this, is how to go about doing this. And I need to operationalize my question. And to conclude, if I were to be able to define tonality noumenally, I can ground judgments in a normative principle. We can unite various approaches of aesthetic theories, i.e. response theory and formalism, prototype theory, etc. We can provide objectivity in discussions of beauty, and that objectivity allows for cross-cultural comparisons of different uses of transcendental musical ideals. And finally, a bracketing of normative musical traits helps response theories better understand the actual influence of context on perception. So thanks to LSU and the Music Cognition Lab and the LSU Graduate Student Association and SEMPRE for helping with travel expenses. So any questions? Thank you.
Okay.
This is really interesting. So one thing that makes music really different than a pen is that every user of a pen is an expert user of a pen, right? And not every user of music is an expert user of music, because there's a difference between a composer and a listener, right? And so when you're mapping what you're talking about is the noumenal object of music, it means a different thing when you observe it as a composer as opposed to observe it as a listener, right? And so if you're sort of mapping what it means to be tonal, you have a fundamentally different relationship to what it means to be tonal as opposed to what it means to be almost anything else in the world, right? like language or pens. Like music is one of the few things that there's a real difference between what it means to be a producer and what it means to be a consumer of it, right? And so there's almost a different object of what it means to be tonal from those two different perspectives, right?
Yeah, it in a certain sense, yes, I agree with you. That's the Heidegger example of teleology or purposiveness is the pen use, but I think in a certain sense, yes, you're getting at part of the problem of like perceivers actually being different, and so it's not exactly the same. But I do think that there's something to be said about like I might perceive like the color of that the wall or something to be slightly different than you, but we can't really identify that. But that doesn't make the wall not beige or something. So I guess that's kind of what I'm getting at is like, yes, a pen has a different purposiveness than the way that music might have it, but that doesn't mean that you can't make claims about music that are purposive, I guess, if that makes sense. So like at this, I'm not saying like Western tonality is the tonality in nature. It's more of like, is there something in the sound waves, like we perceive red to be red or beige to be beige, in this organization that, yes, some people might be better at discriminating or verbalizing that discrimination, but it doesn't make it not true that it exists, if that makes sense. Yeah, so yeah, that's a helpful point though, and a point of clarification for me that needs to be teased out some more.
Thank you. Yeah, I was sort of piggybacking off of what you were just getting into there. Like, what is the definition of music? Is it sounds in nature, or is it music as a manifestation of our perceptions of it? But also then, are you trying to think of it as sticking into like Western canon, Western definition of tonality, or like expanding into a lot of modern stuff, electronic stuff? Like, I wouldn't call it tonal or atonal, but it's not like, tonal as we think of it as, classical Western music.
Yeah, and that's where I think the tonality as a noun versus an adjective is helpful, because I don't want to say that this Western tonality or Eastern tonality or whatever is the tonality I'm describing. I think I'm using that word to describe like something independent of us, to avoid a certain relativism when we're talking about aesthetic value judgments. So rooting the discussion or the value judgment from the subject and moving it back to the object, I think is a big goal of what I'm trying to do.
And that again, as opposed to like classic definition of like Schoenberg atonality, like it's, finding that definition that's not one thing and it's not the exact opposite, but okay. So a new definition is hard to define, right?
Yeah, yeah, especially when it's not fleshed out yet, right? Cool.
Hi, Connor.
Hey.
There was, first of all, thank you. I really enjoyed that. I'm just going to prod you right now.
Yep.
There was one slide where you said, in the future, I want to maybe operationalize some of these thoughts.
Yeah.
And I thought, yes, can't wait. And have you thought about that? Like, how can we operationalize these?
Yeah, I think operationalizing it in one way is sort of digging into some of what Savage found is one way that I'm going to do, because I think the statistical way is a way that I can get at the properties of music without getting into some of the like behavioral or cognitive psychology research. So I can start talking about music, and I can talk about it universally in that way. So I don't have to just say, well, I only have access to students at Louisiana State. I can get access to other corporate and things like that. So I think statistically, that's probably the way to do it, is some of the universal questions.
All right, is there any more questions? I guess that, one more. We have time?
Okay, thank you. Just one quick question. I think I noticed toward the end you mentioned proposing like objectivity and like discussions of aesthetic or
Mhm.
or yeah. Um, and I was just, I was thinking about that because I think I've always sort of thought of like, being objective when it comes to like aesthetics and like preferences. Like, how can you do that when most people think of it as being like subjective? And you just mentioned like talking about tonality in terms of like as a noun, and what's another way to do that just to help me, like how could I make it more objective when talking about aesthetics?
Yeah, I mean, I think one way is we're often afraid to criticize music because other people perceive it to be as a subjective thing. So I think that one way is to keep tonality, like in the way that I'm using it, independent of sort of the value judgments that you might make. Because like you don't it in one way you want to talk about beauty as objective, and then the other way you don't want to assign these value judgments to things that aren't appropriate to assign value judgments to, right? So I think one thing is it brings, I'm not really sure how to answer that question yet. That's, yeah, part of the future directions is getting this flashed out so that you can start talking about music as an object rather than like the beauty in it is because I think it's beautiful. And I'm not really sure how to do that just yet, like on it, to be totally honest. Yeah.
All right, unless there's any final questions, then that concludes our session for tonight in musical structure. Thank you very much, everybody, for attending.